Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is Geoff Bessin. I will be your host for the next 40 minutes or so. Nobody hates short webinars, so I'll do what I can to keep it on the brief side if possible. I know from experience, I do a lot of webinars. People tend to be a little fashionably late, so we're going to wait just another 30 seconds or so to give people a chance to attend. As I communicated in my email, I will be recording the session and will be happy to distribute that recording to you and to anybody else who registered so you can catch up on it, give it to somebody who didn't see it, etc. I do really appreciate the indulgence you gave me, allowing me to contact you via email. I actually discovered, I've been a member for a very short period of time. I know very little about non-digital creative design. It is not a space I'm familiar with. I've always been on the digital side. So I'm very new to the organization, very new to the space, and I don't even know my way around the organization very well. And I thought the best way to kind of give back would be to email you and tell you about this webinar, only to discover I could have posted this in a newsletter, an SEGD newsletter, and you all could have found out about it, and I wouldn't have had to bother you by email. So lesson learned, but I appreciate you being kind and accepting my email. I do promise this is entirely about the field with which I am familiar. It is not about my company software. Of course, I know this field because of my company software, but that is not germane to this discussion. The other thing that I find ironic is we're going to be talking about interactive digital experiences, interactivity, and yet we're in completely different places, speaking virtually with no true interaction beyond, I guess, you're staring at my face. It's a shame. My company doesn't do a lot of trade shows. We do a little bit, haven't done it in 3 years, and we all know why. And our first trade show in 3 years will be next month. So for the first time in 3 years, I'll have to wear pants when I speak to somebody in a business context. I have not broken my pants rule yet, but that's just left to your own imagination. So I think I've vamped enough. I think it's a good time to get started. Let me just point out that if you do have any questions, and I'll need my glasses to do it, but if you look in the GoToWebinar toolbar on your desktop, there's something called questions. Do you see that questions panel? You can type questions in there. I can't hear you. In fact, I don't even know why I have these in. I don't need this. I can't hear what you're saying, but I can see what you're typing. So if at any point you have any questions, please let me know. I'll look in that questions panel and I'll answer your questions. Maybe I'll do it on the fly. I'll certainly do it at the end. I have about 30 minutes of material. I have a lot of material. So we're going to work on pace a little bit. What I've done is I've annotated these slides in a way that they can stand alone. That even if you don't have me speaking, you can still use the material as a reference guide. So it's a very verbose set of slides. I'm not going to read them off to you. I'm going to give you sort of the gist. But I will distribute this content as well. Again, the slides are acting a bit as a reference guide. So you should have a lot of material on hand when we are finished. So let me get started. Again, thank you to those who just joined. We've had a really good turnout. I appreciate that. So today I'll be discussing with you 10 design principles you need when creating interactive digital experiences. Again, I come from the world of digital interactivity. Our customers are building everything from interactive digital signage to information kiosks to museum exhibitions, trade show pitches, real estate, home development promotions, anything in the workplace having to do with employee training or informing them of business-related events. That's what our customers are building, and it's a different paradigm from building a website. It's a different paradigm for building an application for a mobile phone. There are certain principles one needs to concern themselves with, and there are certain approaches one needs to consider. Now, before we talk about those principles, okay, I guess I'll have to use my mouse. Let me just define some terms. So when we talk about interactivity, one naturally thinks touch. That's the obvious example, a finger on a screen, multiple fingers on a screen, multiple people with fingers on a screen. Could be a single display, multi-screen display wall. It is probably beyond speech the most intuitive means of interaction. You will discover certainly that there are lots of touch alternatives, probably nothing more intuitive than touch, but there are many touch alternatives facilitated by technology these days. You have sensors. It could be motion detection, right? Presence detection. Could be lift and learn, maybe RFID or NFC. There's computer vision, where it can identify people, crowds, gender, age, that can even be used to trigger content in context. Of course, there's QR codes, which lets people use their mobile device to take information from a display with them from that venue. Workflow automation, this is the notion of triggering events based on other events. Some of you might be familiar with IFTTT or Zapier, for example, where you can say, well, if I get a text message from Mary, then update my digital sign. You can actually build that sort of thing, and that's an example of workflow automation. There's voice, certainly. We know things like, like Siri and Alexa, this ability to communicate your needs to digital content. Even Windows has native speech recognition and text-to-speech built into the operating system, so it's fairly ubiquitous. And then even the Internet of Things. So these are the devices on the network that can be accessed over that network, maybe to grab information or to impart some information. Some of this interactivity is active. I'm actively doing something. I'm speaking to the screen. Others are passive. I walk by the screen and the motion sensor detects I'm there. I didn't intend to trigger anything, but I passively caused that to happen. So there's really a mix of different kinds of interactivity one might account for in their deployment. And there are a couple certainly reasons to do that. One is hygiene sensitivity. We all know why. Maybe giving people an alternative to touch, but still letting them engage in a modern fashion with digital content. Another reason is accessibility, to enable those with certain physical limitations to still interact with your content. So there are a variety of reasons to consider it, a variety of alternatives to pursue in addition to touch. There is even the interaction that goes on behind the scenes. Now, I will tell you briefly, the reason this is important is the more real-time your project is, the better it is able to retrieve information in the moment, in context, relevant to that person, to that moment of time, to that location, etc., the stickier it will be. And the only reason you can pull that off, the only way you can do it, is by having some live connection with the cloud to retrieve information on the fly. The world isn't on that device. There needs to be a way to retrieve that information. Well, that's interactivity as well, and it's something to consider when you want to make things sticky and deeply engaging. Can you access information that is not resident on the device to increase that level of engagement? When we talk about in-venue, I'm going to use the expression in-venue a lot. That's what all of SEGD is about, of course, which is that physical space. It's not their personal device, which goes with them to every space. It's not about the PC. It's about where the audience is going. It could be the workplace, the museum, the sports stadium, what have you. Traditional in-venue content, that's broadcast content, and one typically thinks of that as a sign. We're here talking about interactive in-venue content. It's human-driven. It's not based on day parting and on certain periods of time. No, it's initiated by some type of human interaction. It can be deeply personalized. It is in context. It is a rich resource for analytics. There's lots of relevant data to collect in real time from an interactive deployment. It's really an application. And typically when you look at a digital sign in a store or what have you, you don't think that's a great app, but it really kind of is. The sign is that broadcast medium. It is not aware of its environment. Once you bring that level of awareness to the device, you're actually building an application. So this is maybe a tougher row to hoe than some might anticipate. I won't go very deep into why bother with interactivity. Certainly engagement and conversion is the primary driver. It's to make things stickier. If you have a sign promoting something passively to a generic audience based on no particular context, or you're running a promotion but it encourages interaction, it is relevant to the context. Oh, that's a 30-year-old female, that's a 20-year-old male, we're going to show something different. That increases engagement and ultimately conversion, and we'll talk about conversion later. So there are certainly incentives for adopting interactivity and not just relying on static, generic, hard to change content. Forgive me, be it print or digital. Okay, great. So that just kind of sets the table. We'll go into the 10 principles. I have a lot of content to cover. Again, if you have any questions, please use that questions panel in the GoToWebinar toolbar. I will also make sure this time at the end of this webinar to answer your questions as well. All right. Principle number one, know your audience. And I will, forgive me, some of this might be relevant to the kind of work that you do, but there will be spins on it because it's digital interactivity. There are certain things to consider. Demographics is an obvious one. One always needs to establish this, to consider the age, the gender, the background. What can we assume these people are bringing to that screen? What is their background? What do they typically anticipate? What appeals to them, right? This is pretty common. This isn't just about digital until you think about their comfort level with technology, right? There are certainly, my 11-year-old son is much more comfortable engaging with something through touch than his grandmother. It's not her fault. She's got an iPhone too, but there's a level of comfort there. Well, who is your audience and what is their level of comfort and level of expectation? You can come up with amazingly funky ways of interacting with gestures and making funky signs and sensors, but depending on your audience, there's no way they'll be comfortable with that. And just because it's cool to you doesn't mean it's going to be effective. So you really need to understand, who are these people? What is bringing them here? What will make them interested? What will keep them engaged? If I'm building an exhibit for a children's museum, have at it, right? Have a blast. If it's a retirement community, you might need to scale back a little bit what you want to do with interactivity. Then there are things like font and font size, and you all have to worry about this regardless of what you're working on, as long as you're thinking about text. This certainly comes down to things: are they colorblind? Do they see well at all? Right? Are there certain fonts that are better than others? This general notion. Now think about it. I might have a 12-inch digital display. I might have a 65-inch digital display. I might have a multi-screen display wall. So I'm going to have a lot of flexibility in determining, well, how big am I going to make my text? How big am I going to make my buttons? How easily accessible will this content be? And does that need to vary based on the size, the physical size of the digital display? It doesn't matter what the pixel dimensions are, 2K, 4K, 8K, doesn't matter. Literally physically, how big is that thing? And what is the appropriate size for that display to make sure that it appeals to anyone regardless of their skill set or their level of education, etc. Number two, keeping it simple. Obviously, pictures are better than words, right? So if you can say it with a graphic, you want to do it. The irony, of course, is you want people to interact. So you need to find that smart balance between creating something that is easily understood, easily intuited, but also driving them to engage and want more out of it at the same time. But big picture, you don't want to over-engineer. It would be fun to over-engineer, as I mentioned earlier, coming up with cool gestures or really funky visuals to display information. But know your audience. For a lot of them, they're not going to stick around to try to figure things out. You need to come up with something very intuitive and easy to understand to drive them to the ultimate goal of that engagement. So be sensitive to that. Even certain things like buttons. Don't have 50 little tiny buttons, right? You want big, large buttons. There's an accessibility angle to this, but again, you don't want to make it hard for people to touch it. And it could even come down to the technology you're using to identify the touch. There are multiple technologies that identify touch, PCAP and infrared and acoustic wave, and there's all these different methods of detecting touch. Depending on the technology you adopt for your deployment, it will be more or less accurate in mapping the touch to the digital display. Your phone, probably it's PCAP. It's very specific to the touch point. Infrared, it's a little less specific. It's good. It's very good, but it's not as good as infrared. And if you have little tiny buttons, will the IR map that touch directly to the button? So make sure that when people are going to interact with things, it's not small and intricate. Number three, attracting attention. Spending all that time to build this amazing experience, you want people to notice it, right? There's a notion of an attract loop, and certainly you want to have some kind of attract loop. In other words, there's digital content that's saying, hey, I'm over here. I'm over here, guys. You want to interact with me? Something that catches the eye. Something that makes it obvious that it's a touch screen. Don't assume people know it's a touch screen. Don't assume people wanted touch screens these days, right? So if it's a touch screen, you want to make sure they understand it is. Whole other webinar we can have about creating environments that are conducive to touch. Maybe you have some sort of Purell station or something next to the screen. But certainly you need to make sure people understand it is an interactive display and that they're encouraged to interact. The environment. Is it loud? Is it bright? What will kind of bleed over into that interaction? Are you competing with that? Maybe you really want to take advantage of audio, but if it's in a loud environment, if you're in a department store that's blasting music, any kind of sounds coming from the digital display might be masked. It might be hard to hear it. Are you sure that's a good idea? So you need to really understand the environment, take it into consideration, and build that into your design to make sure that you are balancing what will be most effective with competing with the environment and just being annoying and not fun and people walking away. Continuing with attracting attention, you want to make sure that there's some sort of elegant transition from user to user. In other words, you have this great attract loop and somebody sees it and they fall in love and they want to interact with your content and they walk up and they do stuff and they loved it and they walk away and the screen sits there where the last person left it. Well, that's no good. It needs to reset itself, right? So you need to figure out ways to understand when to reset. And depending on the approach you use to develop this experience and the approach you take, there are various ways to do it. It could just be a timeout, but maybe the person is still there. Maybe you have a camera and you wait for somebody to walk away. So it's very important, and maybe you need a start over button as well, but you want to make sure that it does reset because otherwise it's going to be stuck some random screen and nobody else is going to walk up to it. Presence detection is a really cool means of facilitating the reset and also just reacting to the user. If I'm walking by a screen and the screen says, hey man, come on over, that was a good thing, right? And that was thanks to a motion sensor or a presence sensor, a proximity sensor. And there are some great companies out there making these kinds of sensors. They're not hard to work with. Triggering that interaction based on presence is a pretty cool way to do it. You can also do that with cameras. Cameras will identify somebody walking by, and it could even do age and gender. You can have a very contextual, hey, 40-year-old female, come on over. The enclosure also has an influence. I think many of you, particularly if you're not from the digital world, typically this is something you think about, which is the non-digital aspect of that installation. How is that attracting notice? How is that ensuring that the audience sees it, recognizes it in the sea of people and other distractions? What can you do to make it stand out and be of interest to the audience? All of this to attract attention. Privacy. This is a big one, right? And there are a couple angles here. First of all, what are the people going to be doing on that display? Are they going to be typing in their credit card number at some point for purchase? Okay, then you don't want a wall-mounted display facing the store, right? Or if it's some kind of magic mirror where it can show you wearing an outfit, would people want to do that knowing that other folks are going to see it? Probably not, right? You're going to want something more intimate. Maybe it's where you put the screen. Maybe it's the size of the screen. Maybe it's the direction the screen is facing. Is it wall-mounted? Is it table-mounted? Is it on a kiosk where you're varying where that screen is shining, right? Is displaying. So you need to think about the level of intimacy your visitors will be comfortable with when they're interacting. On the other hand, when you got a big bright display and somebody's doing something, it attracts attention, right? At a museum, depending on what you're building, being subtle might be great for the educational moment, but could be done in a way that the typical visitor doesn't notice the kiosk. They don't recognize that there's something they can do. So there are other scenarios where you want the big display. You want it wall mounted or big kiosk display mount so that other people could see it and be interested and be curious and come over, or maybe it's table where people can surround the table and interact. So you got something to think about. There are trade-offs there. Then also from the perspective of privacy is personal information. Europe tends to be a little faster than North America when it comes to privacy. For example, they established GDPR a few years ago, the General Data Protection regulation set of laws, which I'm going to hyper boil it down. And California passed its own privacy law. So it's the GDPR is not the only thing, but it's a sensible one. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to this. My data is my data, not yours. And I have to opt in to you keeping my data. I don't have to opt out from you keeping my data. Data collection is an opt-in, and at any point I can say, I want my data back, you can't have it. That is a hyper-simplified understanding of GDPR. So when you're building some sort of in-venue interactive content that in any way will collect personal information of any kind, it needs to be an opt-in. It needs to be very clear to the user that we're about to collect some information. Are you okay with that? And you can play with the wording and the workflow, but that's the gist of it. You cannot just take stuff. You need to be upfront and let them know. You need to be clear to the user that they can trust this installation or they're not going to use it, right? So be very sensitive to that fact and make sure people understand what's going to happen to prepare them emotionally, legally for this interaction, to make sure that they're giving you something that they're comfortable giving you and know is well protected. This goes back, the third pointer with regard to privacy is about sort of how you're mounting the display in the enclosure. It's similar to this general idea of what level of privacy do you require. Table mounting tends to be an overlooked means of distributing digital content. Certainly the downside to a table mount is you can't see it from a distance. So it doesn't do a very good job of attracting attention. An upside is it accommodates multiple people for a single interaction, whereas if it's wall mounted, for example, how many people can be on it at the same time? So that could be of interest. There are also, we've seen it where it's very intimate installation. It's almost like a voting booth. So it's a smaller display and there's kind of walls, and it depends on the interaction. So this is, you really need to give that some consideration. But touch is always going to appeal. And if you can, typically what you're going to be building is for an audience, not for an individual, typically. Even my company's software is used to build retail applications where people are making purchases. That's an intimate activity where I'm swiping my card, I'm entering stuff. It's very private. But typically you're creating experiences that are intended to be noticed, intended to draw a crowd. So embrace that and think big if you can, because you'll be surprised, even at a trade show. You got a lot of people, you have a busy floor, even a kiosk can be hard to see. It can be hard to see. People surrounding it, maybe you have no idea it's there. You do all this good work, you want to make sure people notice it. Okay, number 5, measure to mature. I don't see any questions. I'll just make sure one more time people know. You have that questions panel. If you have any questions, please type it in there. So measure to mature. One of the beauties of interactive digital content, I mentioned this at the beginning, you actually have something to measure. If you have print content or static digital content, there are no direct metrics. Everything is a secondary metric. It is very hard to know, is this working or not? You might have multiple measures of return on investment. There could be multiple goals for a particular deployment, but clearly the best thing you can do is measure stuff about it to help you determine, is it working? Did we do a good job? Is there something we can do to make it more effective? When you're working with digital content, one of the first things you should be thinking about is there anything we can collect that will help us answer questions of, is it successful? What's not working? What is working? How can we make it better? Think of that way up front. What can you collect through the digital deployment to help you assess its effectiveness? And this can vary tremendously. It could be, where is it located? It could be the weather outside. It could be the promotions. Which promotion is most effective? So think about your audience. Think about the call to action. Think about the material and context. What can you gather to help you more effectively steer that project to be more effective? And the beauty of interactive content is you have lots of stuff to measure. You know what they touched, you know how many people walked in front of it, you know what they said, assuming you're collecting these things, right? You know all this stuff. And if that kiosk, if that wall-mounted display, if that iPad is connected to the cloud, you can know things like weather, you can know sports scores, whatever you think is relevant to that interaction that provides color and context can be collected and can use that to identify what's working. So as I said, location, time, weather, so the environmental data, this contextual data is great color for your interaction. Retail is an obvious example. What sells better on a rainy day than on a sunny day? It's something to think about. And to use that information, right? So if you went out of your way to collect it, to identify it, to collect it, to even maybe create visualizations, you got to use it. A lot of you are familiar with A/B testing. That would be one obvious way to do it, right? You could do that, in fact, where you create some sort of A/B test where you do it one way a certain percentage of the time, you do another way the other percentage, and then you compare the two to see which was more effective. Depending on your approach to developing this digital content, you can rapidly make changes and accommodate what you're learning, right? So collect that data, take a look at it, learn from the trends, and use that to tweak it, to fix it. Where was I the other day? This is not even a directly relevant, oh, you know what it was? It's the local pizza place where I live. Big, beautiful menu, you know, behind the register. And then a hand-printed piece of paper on the counter saying, due to supply chain issues, our prices have gone up significantly. The information in the menu does not reflect the actual price, because it's not a digital menu, it's a print menu. And so I have no idea how much my turkey bomb cost. I have no idea, because it wasn't the price up on the board. So using digital technology to deploy your message, to promote, to sell, to educate, whatever, among other things, lets you be agile and to pivot and to make changes. And so take advantage of this information you're collecting through analytics to identify what you want to change, and then change it, depending on the project. I mean, if it's a museum exhibition, I'm sure you're not changing it every day, but you get the point. All right, number 6, don't overlook the hardware. And so I'm coming from the digital world, but I'm really on the software side. So sometimes I think if it's just a great, digital experience, it'll work. Well, hold on a second. Wall mount table or kiosk, large screen or small screen. Do you need maybe accompanying signage, maybe even print signage to direct people that it exists? You need to think about how it's going to exist in that physical space, how it's going to be housed, how it's going to be protected to make sure that it is suitable for the way it's going to be used and for the environment it's in. Like everything in this world, there's a balance between cost and speed and accuracy. I can have a 1-point touch screen. I can have a 64-point touch screen. I can have a 10-inch touch screen. I can have a 65-inch touch screen. I can have a multi-screen display wall. I can have a PCAP display. I can have an infrared display, an acoustic wave display. There's all these different factors that will affect the cost of the hardware. You just got to do your homework. Now, maybe you have somebody in your company, an IT organization that can help. Maybe you're speaking with somebody to help you make the right choices. There's lots of choices, okay? Not to mention the housing in which you're going to put it, that sort of thing. And then there's even the security aspect. We actually have we have lots of museum customers. Some of them are aquariums, and it's a wet environment. So, and they have kids that are just getting their hands wet and dirty and touching the screens. And so one of the things that to think about is to create an enclosure that would protect the hardware from getting wet, to make it kind of smudge proof. I mean, considerations that wouldn't come up in a different context, right? And then even security. It might be great. I'm a museum. Let's give everybody an iPad so they can walk around the exhibit and get information. Well, that's great, but what prevents them from walking away with the iPad? So how are you going to accommodate that to make sure that you hang on to your tech? And so you have all of these other considerations to think about in terms of protecting it and making it secure. Make sure you think about that early. Number 7, a clear call to action. Any of us from the marketing world, I'm on the marketing side of my company, any of us in the marketing world, we all know what a call to action is. What do people expect to get out of this interaction? Even a museum exhibition has a call to action. People are being asked to do something, and the payoff is they've learned something and they had fun doing it. So you really need to think about whether you're building a promo or it's worker education or whatever it is. What's the ultimate goal? And make sure you understand what that is at the very beginning. Don't just be obsessed with doing something cool and letting people play with content, right? Don't clutter. So a lot of these are kind of basics from the marketing world. You know, make sure, don't give them 10 calls to action. Don't distract them with things that might be cool, but don't drive them to the ultimate goal. I mean, nobody's investing in these interactive digital deployments just because they got some money lying around. There's an objective. There's something they want to achieve. Again, it might just be education, but make sure you're driving people in that direction. Provide some incentives, right? Maybe you attract them, but it's not sticky. It doesn't keep them there. And so you need to assess it, and not just is it visually cool, but does it keep them engaged? Does it help pull them along the path that you're measuring for them, that you're creating for them? And then measuring to improve. So making sure that all along the way you're collecting information. And how many people are you driving to this goal? Does it vary based on time of day or based on information you learn from the camera, based on the weather outside? What can you learn about that to create better incentives and maybe a more effective call to action? Designing for usability, number 8. We talked about this a little bit, right? Again, graphic-based instructions are the best. Keep the level of interaction simple. I know you want to come up with great gestures or have them say really complicated things, and maybe you can, depending on the audience, depending on the environment and the intent, you can. But for the most part, keep it simple, keep it obvious, certain specific, very common sense gestures or touches on the screen or things people say, very simple UI. Make sure people don't get lost is the gist of it. And that even comes down to maybe a website best practice like having breadcrumbs. People understand there's a journey. They know where they are in the journey. They can go back in that journey. It depends what you're doing. Maybe it's not relevant. But if there's a chance that there's multiple steps, you don't want them to get lost, don't want them to get flustered, right? So here's where you are, here's where you're going. You can always go back. So these are the kind of things you want to think about because it's dynamically reacting to them. They can get lost. So you want to be aware of that. Always give them a way to start over, to send them home. That should be obvious. I see this a lot with our own customers. They build this amazing stuff, but you kind of get stuck and you can't get out of where you are. And most people, instead of trying to figure it out, just walk away. Give them the escape hatch. You know, I want to go back. How do I start over? Right? I'm pointing this way because that's my left, but I think it's coming off as your right. But home buttons are usually in the left, I think. Usually. Providing feedback. So visual and auditory feedback. Did I do something? I touched it. Is something happening? You know, depending on how you build it, the reactions might be fairly instantaneous, but depending on what's going on, it might take a little bit of time. Does the user know that they did what they were asked to do? You can always provide auditory feedback, again, depending on the environment, depending on the person, they're not going to hear it. Conversely, visually, maybe the button, you know, swells or something, but depending how well they see, they didn't see it. But consider what you can do to let people know that, yeah, what I've done has been recognized. Okay, I know I need to wait for something, and they're waiting for it. Number 9, told you it's a lot of stuff. But again, you can see I've documented this in a way that it can kind of stand alone. So number 9, test, test, test. You got something wrong. I'm sorry, you got something wrong. I don't know what it is. The only way we'll know is if you test it, but you got something wrong. So be humble, run a pilot, figure out some things, collect your data, do what you have to do to make sure you build something good. And then when you deploy it, you do more analytics to keep your eye on things to make sure it works. But even up front, be humble. You got something wrong, you missed something, you forgot to ask a relevant question, run that pilot, figure some things out. Did you understand the environment correctly or the target user correctly? Are you collecting the right data? That sort of thing. And make sure you're there. We live in a global economy. We have lots of agency and integrator customers. Their clients could be all over the globe. They'll never meet each other face to face. Okay, got it. But that really raises the bar and what that agency needs to do to make sure they really understand the target location. Because sometimes until you're there, you didn't really know. And it's notorious that what you get from the client isn't exactly what they meant. And they only really know what they meant when they see what you did. And they go, oh, okay, no, that's not what I wanted. Now that I see what you did, no, that's not what I want, right? So location is one of those things. If at all possible, you want to visit that location, get to know it. Understand the network you're dealing with as well. We have customers installing things in shopping malls, which notoriously have really lousy network connectivity. Well, okay, then you better not be building something that depends on really fat bandwidth and streaming video. It's not going to work, right? You need to know that up front. Don't spend time building an experience only to discover when you're ready to deploy that it's never going to work because of the network, which is completely out of your control. So if it can be fast and reliable, that's great. Make sure it is. But if not, okay, then you need to build something to accommodate. And like any project, I don't need to tell you guys this, expect the requirements to change, expect the scope to change. One of the benefits of a pilot is the clients can see it and they go, all right, I hate it, and we need to start over. And so expect those changes and set up your timeline accordingly. It's the same for digital. One of the nice things about digital is maybe you can be a little more agile in making those changes, that's all. Finally, number 10, prepare to share. And this is about collaboration with your colleagues. I don't know the print world particularly well and furniture very well, but in the digital world, the notion of collaboration and multiple editors is fairly common. And you need to be sensitive to things like the way you name stuff. Right? If you name images, image 1, image 2, image 3, well, you know, I know my messy desk, but nobody else is going to find anything on it. If I give my media lousy names, I might know what they are, but nobody else is going to understand what they are. So you need to establish sort of naming conventions. You need to document the process, recording your notes and information. Here's why I did this. Here's what happens here, so that you're on vacation, you get a better job offer. I mean, whether you're promoted, whatever it is, other people can look at your work and be able to take over from where you left off. When you're working with digital media, this becomes super important. And even the notion of creating templates, of building kind of repeatable things that you can use to accelerate the development process, could even be used pre-sales, where you create storyboards, wireframes, prototypes that you can use pre-sales to say, did you mean something like this? And that the client can interact with it and say, that's exactly what I didn't want, and here's what I need. Do that pre-sales, which makes a very compelling pre-sales engagement, by the way. But create these templates, let you crank things out quickly, try stuff, and grow the scale of your team to adapt to the volume of new work or the volume of requirements coming from a client. Okay, 10. Those were 10 principles. And I hope that fire hose was helpful. There are all different types of digital projects out there. It could be high volume, so low creative, low volume, high creative. I don't know where the world you're coming from. I don't know how familiar you are with it. There's a spectrum. I hope my hand is following the graphic for you. There's a spectrum of projects that would benefit from digital interaction, from moving away from print or some kind of furniture to digital, visually engaging, interactive content for any kind of audience in any venue with any call to action, any purpose. There's so much you can do, right? And there's so much technology out there to facilitate it that you certainly shouldn't be scared. You just need to make sure you understand the principles to do it effectively. So I want to thank you guys for bearing with me. I do see some questions. So here's a story. I'm going to read the questions and answer them. And I'm going to stick around as long as you guys have questions. So I don't know how long you have, but I'll stick around until there aren't any more because I have nowhere to be. I've opened myself up. So I'm looking at the questions panel and see if anybody has any questions. Actually, I answered the questions that I'm seeing. One thing I will tell you is that if you're pursuing this world, I think one of the turnoffs for digital interactive content is the perception that one needs to write custom code. That is my company's general value proposition. My company, Intuiface, it's a software company. You can use Intuiface to build interactive content without writing code. But certainly a lot of you might work with agencies or integrators that have your own development staff. All the principles I share with you can be used for that as well. It's not particular to my company or my company's product. One other point I wanted to address, and I have a moment, I'll still look to see if you have any questions, but the notion of touch post-COVID. Are we post-COVID? I don't know if we're post-COVID. We're sort of post-COVID, right? We're kind of in there where COVID is becoming more like the flu. There was a perception at the beginning of the pandemic that touch would be dead. Nobody's going to touch anything anymore. By the way, we were still touching doorknobs. We were still opening doors. You know, we were still touching the plate of food that was packed for us. But for some reason, people thought touch screens were going to be dead. Now, here's the reality where we're long past the early pandemic. Touchscreen use exploded. It went up, partly because self-service went up, but also because we got so used to antiseptic, to Purell, that we were more comfortable touching a screen and washing our hands than talking to somebody, which is terrible for society, for culture, but it's good, it's healthy for projects that were being created to appeal to an audience without requiring live interaction. So on the contrary, it's touch screens aren't dead, touch isn't dead. It's a reawakening, enabling people to interact with content rather than people to make a transaction, get information. It's a wayfinder or whatever it is, you know. But touch alternatives do exist, so you can give that audience alternatives. Not everybody's fine with touch. The use of touch has exploded, but not everybody's fine with touch. So can you accommodate gesture? How about a QR code so they can use their phone and interact with the content using their phone to interact with the content, or voice, or what have you? There are other means of interaction. And so when you're working with your clients, you need to understand who that audience is, what their expectations are, and what level of interactivity your client wants. Is it just touch? Is it no touch at all? Do they want to explore different types of interaction? Would those different types of interaction work in the environment? And then what hardware options exist out there to facilitate lots of these things, like understanding voice or seeing gestures, that sort of thing. So digital interactivity is alive and very well in this pre-post-COVID world. But alternatives do exist as well. I have been asked a couple other questions about emailing a copy. So everybody who registered, even those of you who hear me but you didn't attend, everybody will get a copy of the slides and of the recording. So I'll wait another moment, see if there's any other questions. I don't have any right now. I imagine if you're new to the space, everything is new, so you don't have any questions. But I'll give you a moment. That was my timer. I have learned my lesson, so from now on, if I want to communicate with people, I use the SEGD newsletter. I will be participating in various forums as much as I can. I do know there's an event in June. I'm seeing what I can do. I'm in, my company goes to a show called ISC, that's in Barcelona, that's in May. There's also a digital signage, it used to be called Digital Signage Expo. I don't know what they're calling it now. That's in Vegas in November. There's Infocom, which is in Vegas or Orlando. I think that's in June. I'd love to attend the SEGD event. I'm not sure. So, and if anybody can tell me if there's a way to say SEGD as a word instead of the 4 letters, I would appreciate that as well. SEGD? Do people have a word for that? I don't know. Well, I tell you what, I don't see any other questions. I do appreciate everybody for attending. I hope you found this valuable. From now on, I will communicate through the newsletter if I have other material I would love to share. And I'll be keeping my eyes open on the forums in the community because I'm very excited to be a participant of your community. So thank you for welcoming me to your screen and to welcoming me into your community. I hope you found this valuable. Take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.